I'm Zina, a tech writer at the Spatio Media Incubator and a contributor to Entrepreneur, the search for and other publications who covers all things AI. So, according to Insight from Boston Consulting Group, only 26% of companies manage to move beyond proof of concept and actually achieve value at scale when implementing AI. In fact, this is a repeated challenge for firms across all industries who are looking to automate processes for driving business results. They miss the key details that make or break AI deployment. Fortunately, there are ways to navigate this challenge while ensuring a future-thinking approach to adopting AI. We'll be diving into how companies are driving real business results while avoiding common risks and keeping an eye on the bigger picture. Joining me today is Firoz Lahir, the SVP of Future Tech 10 Pearls. Firoz is an AI and machine learning expert with over 12 years of experience in financial services, including roles at Capital One, Smart Assets, and Silicon Valley Bank. He's led groundbreaking work in credit scoring, fraud detection, and most recently, AI-driven underwriting for underserved communities in Africa. Firoz is an advocate for equity in tech, having taught STEM to underserved youth and championed DEI initiatives at Capital One and throughout his career. So my first question for you is, what do you think organizations tend to overlook when aiming to implement when embarking on an AI program?
Yeah, great to join you, Zena, on this conversation. I think the first thing that we see that people overlook is that it needs to be a program, right? There's AI tools and models that we choose are just one piece of that. You have to think about how you're feeding these models and tools with high quality data consistently. You have to think about putting the right governance structures in place and the right guardrails to make sure that they're all doing the things that we expect them to do and nothing else. You need to make sure, and we work with our customers obviously to make sure that the investments are aligned really well with whatever the organization or business's mission is and what they're trying to enhance. And then there's change management that's often overlooked. There are opportunities for people to change the role that they're working in as we introduce these new tools. And there's also this issue that we want people to adopt the tools as we build them, and that doesn't happen automatically. And so when you said earlier that sometimes people are struggling with getting beyond a prototype and actually getting to production, we find that one of the big reasons is because getting people to adopt and change it is never automatic and requires some strategy and some real intention there. And then just again remembering that all of this stuff, we're still in the first few chapters of this AI story, and so that's another reason why it really does need to be a proper program, because there's every single week, every single month, there's new things coming out that'll be true probably for another few years. And so just making sure that you can take advantage of these new things as they come out is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you say about, we're in the first few chapters of this AI story. This is something that is, I think, super important for people to remember. And also, as you've mentioned as well, in addition that there's just so many new innovations coming out every month, new solutions, new technology, which obviously, when you're stacking solutions within a digital ecosystem, things can get really complicated really fast. And this leads me into my second question. When companies are looking to implement AI, deploy it, build programs, build workflow, automate workflows, it's about actually driving real impact in the real world, right? Like we're using these digital tools for real business outcomes. So my second question is, why does automation need to be linked to these real outcomes?
I think it's easy to lose sight of that, but it's really important, right? Unless you're a company that is building AI technology, then AI is not the point, right? That this is a tool, and it's one of a lot of tools that we have. It's a really important one. It's really interesting new one. But the purpose is to drive whatever outcome you were trying to drive before, right? So whatever it is that allowed you to have the impact that you want to have on your customers or your stakeholders or whatever it is that allows you to generate value, this is potentially interesting new tool applied in the right places that helps to accelerate the same outcomes. So I think one thing that is difficult sometimes is that with any new technologies, you can get kind of target fixation where you say like the purpose is to AI us, and that's not really, I think the outcome that you're trying to drive, the outcome you're trying to drive should be the same outcome that you were trying to drive before, but just with better tools.
So essentially, it's a means to an end, right?
Yes, you're right.
And you've touched on, driving value. And of course, like we often hear this associated with any technology that's meant to be like value driving, that vision to be obviously the results at the end is what's really important. My next question for you, it's around measuring those results. So what are we looking at? What do companies need to be focused on in terms of like the end, the end results that we're looking at, the why essentially behind implementing AI in the first place? And that question specifically is, what outcomes and metrics do you recommend prioritizing to measure AI success?
Yeah, I think the first thought is to not invent new outcomes or new metrics, right? And so again, if you believe that this is a way to do whatever it is that you're doing better, then we definitely encourage taking KPIs or other measures that you have in place already. For example, how many of your customers were able to satisfy their concern in X number of minutes, and how many of those had a positive impression of that encounter, et cetera. Like those are the same. And then what you should be doing, and what we obviously help do, is to then figure out which AI technologies could drive those same KPIs in a better way than you were doing before you were using AI technology. So we're always a little bit or less excited maybe to think about it again as like how much AI are we using, or KPIs that are kind of technology driven, and I think better outcomes come. And we certainly like to work in situations where we are very focused on the business uh, outcomes and the way that those are measured now, right? So whatever KPIs that you were already driving towards, it typically it's good to just sort of focus on those and use this additional tool to get better at those.
So ultimately, it's not about reinventing the wheel, but making it turn faster and more smoothly, so to speak, if we run with the metaphor here.
Yeah, and not make we're not serving AI, right? The AI is meant to be serving whatever it is that we're trying to get done. And so I think having those same KPIs that we already had is a way to do that, is a way to force that.
Yeah. So, just off the like within this topic of the KPIs, do you find that companies, like in your experience as an external expert coming in to help companies with their technology strategies and their AI strategies, particularly, do you find there's any areas around like KPI setting or measuring, keeping a pulse on AI metric building? Do you find or specific areas that companies struggle with when it comes to these parameters or implementing these parameters?
Yeah, I think, and this kind of goes back to what you said at the top of the discussion here, which is that this is where it becomes difficult, I think, to go from prototypes to production, because in order to actually drive real improvements in whatever it is that you're measuring, it requires more than just the AI piece itself. It requires data, it requires integration, it requires change management, it requires adoption. Like there's lots of other things that are part of introducing any new technology, but it's easy to sometimes like think that because you saw in the demo and it works, that it's going to work in production, it's going to drive real results. I think there's sometimes some disappointment that happens when you sort of make that leap if you haven't really thought those things through, right? And so the question is like, can the new technology drive that change? And if so, what else needs to be there? What else needs to be true around that new technology to really see that happen, right? And that's, I think, part of what is the challenge between going from a cool demo or a cool prototype to a real production system.
That's really interesting, talking about like the prototyping or the demoing stage and then seeing that all the way through to the final implementation, seeing that product come into fruition or that service being actioned. And within that journey, what are the most common gaps? And why do you think these errors in planning are so prevalent? For instance, when they're laying that groundwork for the prototyping, for the demoing, what kind of gaps tend to come up?
I think part of it that's sort of interesting is that these tools so quickly demo so well. Right? It with people, you would say that these are people who interview really well, right? And these new technologies can be really impressive, and even in a very small demo that you make in a day or two or a week, it looks like they're pretty amazing. I think taking a step back and understanding how they work, and how, what actually drives them, then leads you to realize that, okay, yeah, to go to production, it's going to be more than just that. Like, we have to make it secure. We have to make it safe. We have to make sure that the right data is going into it. We have to make sure, whether it's different prompting or different things we're looking up from other systems to put into the context of, say, an LM or a GPT, whether it's other AIs and other ML techniques that we're building around it. All of these things at the end of the day depend on good data, and good data today, good data tomorrow, consistency with it. If you see bubbles of difficult data going through these systems, they will make difficult decisions that you didn't want, or tell customers bad things that you didn't want them to you didn't want to tell your customer to do, etc. So, like, having a data strategy and having data governance, good strong data governance is definitely a prerequisite. And I think that's something that isn't always obvious, and sometimes people are missing. I think it's one of the reasons why people struggle a little bit with getting these systems into production. The other is governance, right? So there's, just like, again, if the goals are the same as your existing business, then the risks are also pretty much the kind of, pretty similar, right? And so you want to make sure, for example, if it's a customer service application, there's all sorts of guardrails and important things that you want to put around a system that's doing that. If it's a system that decides on supply chain changes or optimizes some sort of like process, some large business process. And there are definitely guardrails there that you would want to have in place to make sure you can trust such a system at scale to operate efficiently. And then skill sets, right? That's the other thing that I think is worth thinking through, and something that we've seen is often a gap is the skill set required to build a prototype of an AI system that looks like it does something really cool is different than the skill set that you need at scale to take a system and actually drive it to production and have it really be meaningful. So that former, like building a prototype, it may be sort of more of your AI sort of experts and people who know how to work with these systems well. I think in production, it's a different space, right? There's a lot more data engineering, a lot more data governance involved. There's a lot more data science involved. There's a lot and a big place for product mindset, design, and UX to make sure these tools can be adopted and be useful to people. And then there's a lot of change management skill that is involved in really running this as a program in production. Those things are not like necessary to get to a good demo, but they're definitely necessary to make a real system.
Yeah, absolutely. These are the foundational elements that ensure that long-term scalable application and yeah, deployment of AI, which is so important. And particularly the data, like I think we've talked about this many times, but and also from what I'm reading as well, the data management is always the first course of it or first core of first starting points with AI, because as you've mentioned, if you've got bad data going in, you're going to have bad outputs and it's just not going to work. And that's where, I think you mentioned this before as well in other discussions that we've had, like the gaps really show in the data, and that's where people tend to run into trouble as well. So having that really strong data governance, data management, those relevant skills around data as well, knowing what to look out for, are so integral to the successful deployment. One area of AI that's being talked about a lot recently, and that's agentic AI or AI agents, which, there's a lot of hype going around the potential increased autonomy of these tools. But rather than just executing actions, they also can facilitate some degree of automated decision making as well, which is really exciting, but of course comes with its own set of risks, etc., and challenges for companies. So I just wanted to ask you, what are the risks attached to, more autonomous AI like AI agents that organizations need to be aware of?
Yeah, I think the first sort of like the underlying one is just misunderstanding what these tools are capable of, right? And so I think just the technology being as new as it is, we see people either underestimating what they're capable of or overestimating what these things are capable of and the type of intelligence that they sort of mimic, right? And so again, it's easy to miss that I'll give you an example in code generation. Like there's lots of very cool demos that say that a system can build an entire application for you, and I think most of us have seen that is true to some extent. But then when you actually start to move things to production or build systems at scale, the truth is a little bit different. And that's to be expected. But what it means is that if you're going to have, for example, automated processes around software deployment, or if you're going to have automated processes that you depend on around model governance, et cetera, like you have to have the right interaction model with the people who are responsible for those risks or managing those risks or responsible for making some of those choices, right? And the easy way to do that is to say, well, we're going to have a human in the loop. And I think in some cases that is sort of effective to an extent, but I think you have to kind of double click on that and say like, okay, well, what does that mean? Because, is that really, there's efficient ways to do that and there's not so efficient ways to do that. And there are also safe ways to do that, not as safe ways to do that. So I think that is not necessarily new risks per se, but like different attention has to be paid to risks that you already probably understand as a company, operational risks and security risks and so on. Those don't necessarily introduce too many new things to that, except for the fact that if you're going to allow a system to make decisions, you can't assume that you can just go with your current sort of like guardrails or your current sort of protections against these risks, because they're going to be different at the scale at which AI operates. And so that's just something that you have to be really intentional about. The other risk that I think is really important is that, kind of going back to what you said about this being early, right? Is vendor lock-in is always a risk in technology. I think it's particularly true here, right? Because it's still very, very early. I don't think anyone can predict what technology will be there in 2026 and 2027 exactly, but I think it's safe to say it's not going to be from a single vendor. And so I think it's particularly important at this stage, this early with these technologies, to not sort of decide that you're going to pick a winner and this is the vendor, the technology vendor that you're going to work with, or this is the system that you're always going to work with, because I think you might find yourself sort of in a bad place in a year when there's some important capability that exists on some other platform. So this is not, again, a new idea, just building your strategy and building your architecture in a way that's flexible and that doesn't, paint you in a corner with tremendous vendor lock-in. But it's just more acute right now, right? Because there's new things coming out every month, and there's a lot of big companies, a lot of money and time is going into AI now, which is really great, right? And that's a big difference than 3 or 4 years ago. But what that comes with is like it's hard to predict where the next big innovations are going to be, and you should expect that you're probably going to work with multiple vendors to get there. And so you just kind of have to build that in.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and it actually makes me think about, like what the Big Four have been advising around AI adoption in particular. I'm talking like BCG, McKinsey, Deloitte, PwC, etc. One word that comes up a lot is agility. It's like the recurring thing that the experts are really encouraging companies to also prioritize alongside innovation, alongside a growth mindset. So is that need for agility. Because as we've said multiple times now, actually, that new innovations, new solutions are coming out each month. You never know what's quite around the corner. And to be so set in your ways, or to have a strategy that's not malleable to what's coming out as well, can also backfire, I suppose. So that need for agility. And would you say as well that it's important to nurture that agility mindset, let's call it, amongst staff, like among the team who are going to be overseeing AI?
Absolutely. That's a great point. Kind of the change management piece of this again is really huge, right? And it's not just, it's for users, it's for executives and leaders who are thinking about how investments are made. It's definitely true for engineering and for product to think about like how you build systems and how you design interfaces so that they will take advantage of the things that are coming. Like I think what you said is exactly right. It's the biggest part of this is really making sure that all of the people in all of the different roles in the organization are understand that this is early, that things will move very, very quickly in the next few years, and are built to be able to agilely keep up with that.
Yeah, it's well, exciting times ahead of us, and so much changing. So yeah. I'm also wondering, what inefficiencies beyond what we've talked about can emerge early on in the processes, like whether it's like prototyping or within embedding AI, where inefficiencies can emerge that defeat the purpose of these automated tools in the first place.
Yeah, I think one that we are spending a lot of time working on lately is the interface. So I think a lot of people were introduced to AI through chat interfaces and ChatGPT and others. And that's kind of like for a lot of people, their first discovery of this new thing, which again is really exciting. And that's why there's a lot of energy and investments going into AI is a result of that. But I think it's worth taking a step back and thinking about whether a chat interface is, for example, really the most efficient thing, right? Is that really what a customer wants to interact with? Is that really what a person in the business who's trying to do something really wants to interact with? 'Cause that may not be efficient. There may be other things that you can do that are AI driven or other interfaces that are AI driven that would just be a lot quicker for people to get things done than having to always chat with an interface. So it's part of like what we do is remind people that ChatGPT or any sort of chat interface is one way that you can surface AI, but certainly not the only way, right? There's lots of other things. The other thing that we spend a lot of time on, I think we talked about this already, is just this idea that having a human in the loop is the band-aid answer to managing risk around these models. And that can sometimes be the right answer to get, and particularly when you're getting started, but having the human in the loop can actually sort of create inefficiency that holds you back from, especially at scale.
When you say human in the loop, like the way I'm imagining it as someone who's not, using some of these really technical AI solutions, like whether it's what manufacturers are using, for instance, where I always imagine some kind of, you know, rather than a chatbot per se, I imagine some kind of dashboard that's being used. And I imagine someone always sitting around the clock looking at this dashboard. Is this like the scenario that you're talking about in the sense that there's someone who's always keeping an eye on those insights that are coming out, what the AI is recommending, what the algorithms are flagging within the data or within, yeah, the information that's being processed.
Yeah, you started that with the most important part of this, which is what you imagine. And I think everyone has a different thing that they're imagining right now about what human beings need to do, or how do we enable people in the organization to govern these AI models to make sure the choices are, the right choices, to make sure if there's communication that goes outside of the org, that it's, it's on brand, all these sorts of things that we have to be careful about. I think it's everyone's sense or imagination of how that should work is a little different right now because it's still early. So I think just double clicking on that is worth doing and making sure that you've got all the risk mitigation strategies that you need in place, but just understand that a lot of those can also be automated, right? And they don't necessarily have to be a person, like you said, looking at dashboard and taking decisions and approving them. That may work in a prototype sort of situation, but that's not going to scale.
And of course, the well-designed tools have checks and balances in place where a human can be brought in when the situation arises for a human, warranting a human's input.
That's another thing that, we're finding is really effective. Like sometimes, just like with people, having an agent with a different perspective or a different hat on, and looking at a different purpose is useful.
That's actually another point that, for instance, yeah, some people don't automatically think about like having those embedded workflows within, you got a specific function of a tool and then also having the checks and balances in place through the form, as you said, of other agents, of other solutions as well. Going back to square one, for instance, like we're going back to where we talk about, the planning and mapping out where AI fits in to drive a result, for instance, like that could be that business wants to cut down on its overhead in terms of like how many hours their teams are spending like manual data entry or like helping with disputes, closing disputes with customers, for instance. But then, for instance, like they want an agent or an AI tool to come in to cut those hours by X amount. Like that could be the result, for instance, the firm that they're using. And in that case, they'd also be looking within the KPIs to see, for instance, if that first solution, there's an issue, then another solution can step in. So we're still not having to draw upon people because obviously the KPIs there reduce the hours. to avoid that situation as much as possible. So it's like that foresight is what I'm really trying to get at the beginning, to make sure those guardrails are in place to stick to that why, like that more than star, so to say, the why of integrating that particular tool in that particular situation.
Yeah, and I think the skill set, going back to the skill set question, that's those are people who understand the processes that you have and are understand the risks around that process and efficiency around that process. And those people also need to be at the table because those things that you said aren't going to show up in a prototype or demo as important things, but they become really important when you go to scale. And so that's another skill set does need to be at the table, and sometimes isn't.
And then, of course, like we've talked about having, specific functions of AI and like specific reasons, for instance, that companies bring in these tools, which makes sense. Like it's common for organizations to approach AI solutions as solving very specific functions. But this can make them lose sight of the bigger picture, but holistically, which is also very important. And one thing I wanted to also touch on is the difference between task automation and outcome automation, which may not be terms that are commonly known to everyone. So I just wanted to gauge your thoughts on the differences between task automation and outcome automation, and why these are crucial to understand when adopting tools like AI agents or AI in general.
Yeah, I think it goes back to kind of the process conversation that we've been having. You can get some very quick wins, and we do see people get some really nice quick wins with not changing anything in the process, and instead just sort of looking really tactically at specific tasks that people are doing, and then finding ways to make those particular tasks more efficient. And certainly we encourage that. I think it's a good way to get started with AI tools. But there's also much larger opportunities that are there if you think about like, well, what's the thing that this whole process was meant to drive? This task is part of the larger process. That whole process is meant to deliver some value or to do something great. Like, how might we think about doing that differently now that we have these tools? That's hard to demo often and hard to sort of like do within, a couple of weeks or something. But if you're going to sort of realize the value of it and really, leverage these tools at scale, that's the kind of thinking that needs to happen. So that again involves engineering and AI experts and great data, but it also involves a lot of process engineering and change management and so forth to make that real.
Thank you for clarifying that. Now, my final question is, what are your thoughts on executive ownership of AI programs? CTO, CDO, CEO, are there any others? And how can the executive leaders set clear success criteria before deploying AI agents?
This is one that is really interesting, certainly from like my seat here at 10 Pearls. It depends on the org, of course, and the size of the org and who has to sort of own it. But one thing that is, I think, universal is that it is early. The other is that people have a lot of great ideas for how to implement AI in their business, and even small businesses can generate those ideas really, really quickly. So it benefits at this point, in our opinion, from having a really clear prioritization framework and a really clear prioritization process so that you can innovate really quickly. And the other thing, that we've been talking about is the fact that the tools keep changing every month. So it's another argument for having sort of one leader, ideally who owns both the innovation around this and the prioritization around this, and then the incorporation or the decision around like tooling and platforms and so forth. So I think there's a really strong argument for that. It also gives you a really clear vision for what success looks like and somebody to own that. That's not going to work for every organization in the world. And some are going to, not, are going to need more of a panel approach. But I think, our theme here is that these things are moving very fast. And being agile is really important. And at this point, this early in the life cycle of this tech, it probably does make sense to have a single owner who at least is driving the prioritization, if nothing else. The CDO is interesting because like the chief data officer in any organization is going to be part of this regardless, right? And so whether that person owns this overall or not, like you should expect that the CDO will obviously have a huge role to play in rolling out real AI at real scale because of the fact that, like we said, data strategy and data architecture and data governance are so critical to success here. So I think that person is certainly part of this, but doesn't necessarily have to always be the owner, depending on the size of the org, et cetera. We have a workshop in particular that where we really dive into that issue because we do think that's super important to set up a company for success, to have a clear vision and a clear innovation framework and a practice that you can follow in driving AI into the organization and a path to scale within an organization. And of course, all of we work a lot in financial services and fintech and healthcare. And so making sure that you have all the right governance and the right mitigants in place for all of the privacy and security, and then telling people the right thing to do, risks that you have and brand risks that you have. It makes sense to have all of those typically in figured out, or at least a plan for that early on so that you don't get stuck again we made a cool prototype and it worked really well, but we don't know how to get it to production stage, which I think, like you said, a lot of companies are kind of at that point now. In 2024, it was like, oh, this is really cool. And in 2025, it's like, and now we're halfway through 2025. It's like, okay, but how are we going to actually make this real? And that's that point at which I think a lot of companies are a little bit stuck right now. And this is a way forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully those companies who are stuck, by following these tips and keeping that holistic picture, can overcome that particular hurdle. So they're moving from prototyping, from getting that off the ground now into actually seeing it through and seeing it come to fruition in the real world to drive those business results, to drive that real world impact. So it sounds like there's a lot on the horizon. Definitely a lot of innovation happening. But yeah, as we've talked about, the innovation, the agility, having that change management, good data. Data is the beating hearts of a strong AI strategy.
Definitely.
Or just some of the signposts that companies need to be paying attention to for successful AI deployment. So thank you for sharing those insights and these strategic and practical tips, which should be northern stars, I think, for AI strategy.